Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. On the show today, Betsy Polatin. So Betsy really impressed me at the Embodiment conference. Her session was easily one of the best, just dynamic and fun and practical and useful. She comes from a strong background in the Alexander technique, also in Peter Levine's somatic experiencing work. She's authored several books, including The Actor's Secret. She's been working with actors, musicians, and the Humanual. And she'll tell us about this, I'm sure, soon. And she's also coming to Brighton very soon. So we're recording this partly just as it's a great, I'm sure will be a great interview in its own right, and also as a little taster for anyone who's thinking about coming to Brighton. So Betsy, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be on the air with you.
It was nice to see you again. And
yes.
How did you get interested in the body? What was the beginning of your journey with this?
Well, when I was younger, I was a dancer, and I really enjoyed that feeling of moving my body. And I wasn't particularly into speaking, in a certain way, but my body spoke for me. And in 1968, I took a class, a choreography class that was, for those of you who know or don't know, choreography is about making up dances. And it happened to be with a man named Albert Pesso. And Albert Pesso is he's since passed, but the inventor of what's now called psychomotor therapy, which is a pretty well-known trauma body therapy. But back then, in 1968, he was just inventing his work. And so we would be in this dance class, and we would stand in a circle. Somebody would stand in the middle and hold their arms open, and they had to face the people in the circle. And you had to say how you felt, how that made you feel. So for me, as a young dancer, it was really my first experience in a conscious way of how body positions and emotional responses were connected. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I was just a kid taking a choreography class, and yet it turned out to be with this person who later has a very, well-known technique for this kind of thing. So I just think of it as, that 50 years ago, you just never know, what your early life experiences, because that experience influenced my life, but not in a conscious way. I never said, oh, I'm going to do this work. It was a very sort of roundabout way. I went on to be a dancer, and, so I've just always been interested and fascinated in how the body moves, and more particularly how it moves in a healthy way. I think that's just always kind of caught my attention.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit about some of the sort of trainings you did since then.
Yeah. So from there, I moved, a little bit after that, moved to New York City, and I studied with a woman named Frances Cott, who was able to understand how the body moves in a healthy way and how to prevent injury. So I would go to the ballet with Frances, and we would sit like in the third balcony, because that's what we could afford in those days. And somebody would do a turn, a pirouette turn and spinning. And Frances would say, oh, that person's going to fall off, or another person, she'll stay on the turn. So there was an understanding of how the body moves and how the muscles pull and how we were able to control that for well-being and for prevention of injury and for recovery from injury. And so that was a big influence in my life. I was with her for 10 years, and then went on to, life took a turn, and I became involved in the Alexander technique. And from my first lesson, which I write about in The Actor's Secret in the introduction, it was an amazing experience there was this whole other aspect of myself that I didn't even know about, and yet it was still me, but it was a different me. And so the principles of the Alexander, I don't teach standard Alexander technique, but the principles that Alexander discovered do influence my work. And I can go on if you want me to.
Yeah. We've had a couple of people on from the Alexander technique. Well, a few, Bruce Furtman and Constance Claire Newman, a couple of other people.
Yes.
Actually. But just very briefly, for those who have not heard of it, because in some circles like music and acting, it's very well known, and others less well known. Could you sort of briefly say what that is?
Yeah, sure. It encompasses so much. One of the best ways to talk about it is that when we're born healthy, and I emphasize that, we move with a kind of grace and a kind of ease and a kind of flow that is easily recognizable. And yet we don't see that same ease in most adults. And that the potential, or what I call that organizing principle, is inside of us, but it's been interfered with. And that's, of course, where the trauma work comes in for me, is something's interfering with my well-being or my ability to move in an organized, healthy way. So that's the way I see the Alexander technique. On some level, it's a neuromuscular re-education on how to move. We could call it that. It's very practical. You move this way, you don't move that way,
Can you say a little bit about the trauma piece there? Because this was the other sort of main strand of your work, right? Studying with P. Levine, I believe.
Yeah. So what was happening is, so in the, I guess the 1980s, I was working at quite a few, prestigious music and drama schools with the Alexander technique. And it's quite welcomed at those schools because it can be very helpful. But what I found both in the university teaching and in my private practice was that some people, like say there was a song to be sung, and somebody could get the song out with the emotion, the movement, and it would just come alive. And other people, it didn't. And sometimes it would, with the Alexander work, it would improve, but sometimes it didn't. And I was just so concerned and curious, like, why isn't that happening for that person? And so I investigated so many different techniques and modalities that are out there. But it wasn't until I read in the 90s, Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine, that just kind of blew me away. It was like, oh my gosh, trauma, yikes, because I wasn't really a trauma person. I wasn't like looking for, that kind of material in people's lives. And yet there it was, hitting me in the face, basically. And I really wondered, could that, the reason that singer couldn't get that song out was because of some seemingly nothing incident that happened when they were a child. And, and the answer turned out to be, yeah, that really could be.
I think trauma is one of those things that all somatic practitioners come across, no matter their modality. If it's Feldenkrais, Alexander, or, in my case, maybe Aikido, I'd grab someone in Aikido and go, wow, that person really overreacted, or wow, that person just seemed, they didn't react at all. They just sort of stood there like a victim, frozen. Grab them, frozen, or their body's got a limpness to it or a tenseness to it that seems, once you've grabbed a few hundred bodies, it becomes very obvious that some of them are a bit different.
Exactly.
Cultural patterns, personality patterns, but then there's something else. And it's like, okay, that's really interesting. Well, why did that girl her eyes light up when she threw me on the floor?
Right.
It seems historically, it seems like it's not about me, like I haven't offended her or anything, So,
right.
So it's like those things happen to us. I'm just giving my martial arts examples, but those things happen to us as somatic practitioners. And then we go, there's something going on here. And I think it can become obvious as well once you're given that lens, I would increasingly go, oh, okay, there's hyperarousal here, or oh, there's numbing here, or freezing, and go, oh, look, that's interesting. Like that lens actually starts to inform more and more. I found as well once I found it.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, Mark. Yeah, it's so clear once you know what you're looking for, or you can't not see it.
Mm. So give us some sort of trauma basics then, because it's getting more and more widely known. But let's start at the beginning. If someone came up to you and they were a somatic practitioner, like a dance teacher or Alexander technique teacher, what would be like the first few things you would tell them about trauma?
Well, I think that I don't know if I would approach. You can't always approach trauma head on, because in my teaching experience. Well, I'll give you an example. So I'm teaching in an acting class, and a young woman does a scene, and as she's doing the scene, after she finishes, she said to me, my head really doesn't want to move. It just wants to stay in one position. So I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. Your head is, able to move in many directions in lots of different ways. Is there any particular reason your head doesn't move? And she said, no. And I said, was there any kind of trauma or difficulty when you were younger? And her answer was no. And that's sort of my point, is when you first ask people often if they've had trauma, their first response is, no, nothing ever happened. I had a happy childhood. It's very often that's the answer. So it goes nowhere, in some way. So with this particular young woman, we continued working. And a few minutes later, she said, oh, wait a minute. When I was younger, I was swimming in the ocean and a wave hit me. And when she said that, she moved her head and her shoulders in a certain way. And I said, that. And she said, oh, yeah, this is the position I hold my head in. And I said, yeah, part of you is living in that moment when that wave hit you. And she got it. But like I said, the important part of the story from your question is that her first response was, no, nothing ever happened.
Yeah. Okay, so a perspective there would be something like trauma can lock us into particular patterns that we may not even remember why or how that happened.
Or think that it mattered. People will say, oh, yeah, well, I fell off my bicycle and I went over the handlebars and I landed on my head. But, oh, it was nothing. I'm like, when they're telling the story, I'm like cringing inside saying, oh, my God, that's awful,
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, we've all had these kind of bumps and knocks, and not everyone's been abused, kind of thing. But many of us have had times when we've been scared, or almost no child escapes without being sort of bullied or hit or something. Right?
Exactly. Or even you get to be a certain age, and then your parents say, okay, now you're going to go in, you're going to sleep in your own room, and it's going to be downstairs. You're a big boy, you can do that. And the poor child is like, no, I'm scared to death to be alone downstairs. You know what I mean? So those things can stick.
Yeah. And these are sort of patterns that get laid down in us. I mean, I'm beginning increasingly to wonder if trauma is the right word that we use.
I agree with you. Yeah.
I mean, what would you say is another alternative? Because how can we compare someone that's afraid to, sleep in their own bedroom or whatever to someone who was in Afghanistan? Is this?
Yeah, I totally agree, Mark. And when in my writings and in my teaching, I talk about overwhelm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that, to me, that makes a bit of a distinction. It's something that is a little more than we all have different setups in our nervous system. And if something comes along that's a little more than my nervous system is ready to handle, I get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And so that's the word I use. And I think that's pretty accurate, because it's something that's either too fast, too soon, or too much. It's too something for my nervous system. Yet for somebody else's nervous system, it might be fine. But for me, it puts me over an edge that is not so comfortable.
Yeah, that feeling of overwhelm, the feeling of not being able to cope. And as you say, we had Irene Lyons on the podcast a while back, and she talks about nervous system regulation and
exactly,
terminology, as it were. But okay, so say a little bit more about trauma, because there seems to be a real appetite right now for learning about trauma, and a real mix of sort of levels of skill I'm imagining out there in terms of their understanding of it. So your take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I got a lot of thoughts around that, because I think to really be able to take in another person's nervous system, you have to have really paid attention to your own, because I think that's a lot of the somatic trauma work. A lot of it is resonance, because there's different ways of taking in information from somebody. There's the person telling you something, which, can or cannot be true in a way. There's your observation, which can have lots of different interpretations. But there's also, and this is one of the really important pieces of a skillful practitioner, is that there's something called somatic resonance. So it's what your own body is picking up from the other person's body, from their nervous system. Even though they may say one thing, you might I get this jolt of like, that doesn't gel with what I think is going on right now. And I mean, I may be wrong too, but I think the idea of somatic resonance is really important, because I mean, like you said, there's a lot of people out there now talking about the body, but personally, from my experience, some of these people really don't, how can I politely say it, really have a deep understanding of both the design of the body and the nervous system. And I think that, if you're going to delve into that territory, you really want to take it seriously, so to speak.
Well, yeah. I'm definitely with you on somatic resonance as one of the major ways, when we coach, I find my students pay a lot of attention to, say, the words they're speaking, the instructions they're giving, and, that's all good. That can be cleaned up and improved upon. But I'm often like, well, the main message you're giving as a coach is through your own body.
Absolutely.
That's the main thing you're conveying. Well,
absolutely. Yeah. Your intonation is so much more than your information, and all of those sort of tests or when they look into when a motivational speaker speaks, how much the audience gets from their body movement and how much the audience gets from their words. And the numbers are staggering. The body wins over hands down.
Yeah. So, we just had Joseph Riggio actually in Riggio in Brighton, and he explicitly says that he talks quite a lot of bullshit, and he's just working implicitly with the body while he's telling these stories.
Ooh, that's great. Yeah,
it's really interesting because you're looking at him going, "What?" He's been working one-on-one with someone, and you're like, "Why?" He's just talking nonsense. He's telling some story about his New Jersey childhood, and then you see the coachee, the client, changing.
Right.
According to the goals they've already set. And it's really amazing. And you go, that's all purely somatic, non-verbal influence that he's working through there. The words really are just a sort of distraction while he's doing it. It's quite fascinating to watch.
Yeah, that's clever. That's it. That's accurate. That's what I was saying before, that you can't always meet the trauma head on.
You also said about sort of things that people should know about if they're working with the body. I'd like to come back to that because I think it's going to be a problem the embodiment world has as we move on, in that people train, it's getting more and more popular, which is great. This podcast figures go up a little bit every month,
Great. It's wonderful.
Yeah. So my, what is embodiment YouTube video seems to be, getting more and more hits. So
that's great. Yeah.
the hashtag on
Great.
Instagram. I mean, it's
I think
clear that
people are interested. Yeah.
people are interested, which is great. And people are interested in trauma, which is great.
Yep.
And one of my colleagues the other day was sort of bemoaning to me how much sort of people there are out there with a small amount of trauma knowledge, or I sort of see things in embodied leadership, which I think, okay, you've done a few weekends. And I'd like to come back to that piece you said on what are the sort of essentials that people know about.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Yeah. I think one aspect of this work that's really, really important, and I'm going to go into it in great detail in the weekend, and obviously we don't have time for great detail today, but that is the work of Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory. That is really informative in the trauma world and in the well-being world. It's not just for trauma, but my point today would be that in any kind of interaction with a coach or a facilitator or a teacher, on any somatic level, that the first line of business, so to speak, is to create safety. Because if your person doesn't feel safe, you will not get to first base with any kind of interaction, because you feel, again, according to Polyvagal, you are either feeling, we're always looking for welcoming or warning, right? And so the safety is welcoming. But if you don't feel that welcome on some or safety on some level, you are looking for warning and you are defending. And when you're defending, the system is not able to go into curiosity, well-being, health, growth, and restoration. You just can't. It's physiologically impossible.
You know, this phrase welcoming versus warning really helps me, Betsy, because I've often found that word safe to be a bit kind of extreme, you know?
Yes.
I get someone that's kind of worked in war zones and stuff like that. When I hear people say they don't feel safe because, I don't know, someone wasn't warm enough to them when they walked into the workshop or whatever, sometimes it feels a little bit of a stretch on the word.
Right. Yes.
Not too fond of the sort of safe space culture and all that kind of thing coming out of the States. But when you say welcoming versus warning, that makes it accessible to me. Like, yeah, we all know that feeling of like, oh, I feel like I'm welcome here. I can I can let my guard down. I can go into learning. As a facilitator, I want people to be in learning mode, not in defensiveness mode, right? Like I don't want them in that fight or flight. I want them open and playful and learning and connecting to each other.
Right. And it's quite simple, in some level. And it's also, like you said, like, oh yeah, that makes sense, We all know it.
I think it's a really useful thing to orientate around as a trainer, though, for me, just to remind myself that, like, how am I creating this feeling of welcoming for people,
Exactly.
so they can do deep learning work, so they can challenge patterns and not just resort to the most hardwired primitive patterns they have.
Exactly. And also and this is, I think, again, I find really something that I emphasize a lot with the people that I work with on so many levels, that those hardwired patterns are people talk about like bad habits and stuff. There are no bad habits.
Yeah.
We did what we needed to do, and thank you for doing that, to that habit. It's like there's, even like you say, those hardwired patterns, they're great because they saved me when I was in trouble. And so I'm really glad that I dissociated, because life was pretty rotten and it was much better for me to dissociate than not. So thank you, dissociation. So now, do I still need to do that? Do I still want to do that? That's where the work comes in.
Yeah, I love this framing because it reassures people like, hey, you're not a bad person that you do this. And actually it totally makes sense that you do this. And
Exactly.
there's something about having this feeling of gratitude for one's patterns and past self, and not feeling judged by others for them as well, not judging oneself. And then just going to the frame of like, okay, and do you want to build your repertoire? Maybe there's something else that's even more useful now.
Yes, exactly. It's like, what else is there?
Yeah. And it just doesn't help. Like I've seen, for example, drug addicts or alcoholics like hating their addiction, and that doesn't help.
No.
What? Actually, I'd probably be dead if it wasn't for alcoholism.
It's true. It's really true.
Like I could be grateful to that and move on. But
exactly.
That's a sort of great starting point, isn't it? Acknowledging that things come from a reason. You do the best you can. Now let's see what else is there.
And to continue that line of thought with the work that I do and you do, I assume, is that those thoughts are great, but also what are the body patterns that go along with that? And we need to address those.
Right. So there's a whole way of being, the embodiment, we might say, that's there that goes along with any kind of past thoughts.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a really important aspect to be able to, because again, those bodily movements or positions are so familiar that you just don't even know, you can't even name them, because it's just who I am. I put that in quotes, or the way I am. And yet there is potential for change, but it doesn't feel like that. And that's, again, a way to get into the pattern.
And how do you work with it when someone really has identified at the level of who they are with a pattern? Like someone might be like, well, I'm a nice person, and placating people and backing off, is who I am. Or I might have, I'm a fighty person, Betsy, and I'm just a fighter, and that's who I am. Like for a long time, I think that was part of my own identity. It's not just like a postural pattern. Like, I don't know, when I cross my arms, my right goes over my left, not the left over the right.
Exactly. Right.
Something really key to my identity.
Yes. And interesting, like when you say, cross your arms, right, it goes one way. So in a way, I might have the person cross their arms the other way, and then they say, oh, that feels so weird, that, that's not me. I'd never do that. And I'd say, yeah, okay, that's what it's going to feel like when we address some of these patterns.
I use that example too. We've independently used that same example because it lets people feel something weird, which isn't like emotionally threatening, but they get the weirdness of a new pattern, right?
Exactly. And it kind of registers like, okay, something will be different, right?
Mm.
I actually do more with folding hands, which thumb is on top. I do it that way.
Yeah. Listeners can try that at home, actually, if you just interlace your fingers and then put the other index finger on top. And you'll feel that, anyone listening to, assuming you're not driving at home.
Or the thumb, the thumb, which thumb is on top?
Yeah, but the index finger will also change, won't it?
Right.
But and this another really nice example of how something can feel really weird, but not be functionally any worse at all.
Exactly. It's just another option that's basically quite available. It's just not my chosen one. And when we think about some of the brain stuff, the neuroscience stuff, which is also really big right now, is that when you do the same pattern over and over again, that channel gets furrowed in your brain.
Yeah, and that's getting wired as familiar.
Yeah, that's where you go. But it's not that there aren't, quite a few other possibilities.
Yeah.
So it's some, if you're adventurous, it's like, oh, well, that might be interesting. Even though it's weird.
Yeah. And is that your basic method then? You're sort of helping people become aware of some of these patterns of posture / being and giving them new options, helping them become informed about sort of trauma aspect of that?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. I think another aspect is the developing the skill, which is, of kinesthetic skill of really tracking on a deeper level of what's going on inside, because when there's difficulty in life, there's usually some kind of pain in the body. So most people don't want to feel their bodies and they live in their heads. That's sort of modern society way of operating. And so it's a real skill and learning to come in touch with the sensations, and there's deeper and deeper levels of those. And then that gets me to answer your question about the fight person, who always, is looking for a fight and is tensing their muscles and is ready for that. But once you start sensing, you get that there's something underneath that. And getting under the pattern is kind of, again, the way in. I don't want to say the trick, because it's not really a trick. It's probably a neurological reality, that there are other sensations, and often that fight response is preventing the welcome that we were talking about before. It's the fighting is a defense.
Yeah.
And yes, again, that was necessary, but what else is there? And you can get to it through the somatic, through the physiology, through the emotion, through the psychological. There's so many. I sort of address whichever way seems appropriate in the moment.
Right.
Or that the person
works.
Yeah, or that the person can handle.
Yeah, and it looks like we're going to get Stephen Porges on the podcast. He's definitely coming to the next conference.
Oh, that's great. He's a wonderful man. He's a really
nice guy as well. Like, he's been very humble, and considering how much of a rock star he is, he's very approachable.
Yeah, he really is. He's one of those people. I've spent quite a bit of time with him, and he's one of those people that really lives what he's teaching. It's amazing. He's a wonderful man, really wonderful.
Yeah, and it's what I love about his work as well. It shows the connection to the social. This idea of, and tell me if I'm wrong, but my sort of understanding is that the fight flight, this trauma reaction, this stress reaction, which can become embedded as a trauma reaction, gets in the way of our social engagement system.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was just saying before with the fighting. Yes, the fight flight sympathetic response prevents the social engagement from being present.
And kind of vice versa as well, right? Like that we can be at least inoculated to some extent due to, secure attachment long term. And if people are feeling sort of warm and connected and welcome, and, I smile at people, I make eye contact, I shake their hands when they come in the training, that's also an inoculation against going into this fight-flight response.
Exactly. That holds down. Yes, there's definitely a hierarchy there's safety, there's danger, and there's life threat. And there's a hierarchy in the way they happen. You feel safe, everything is okay. And then if it's not okay, it goes into danger. And then if the danger persists and continues, then you're in life threat. And it's a hierarchy. It's a predictable pattern.
Okay. And
again, we'll go into that on the weekend. We'll spend quite a bit of time with that because I think it's worth the time.
Yeah. And just Peter Levine's work kind of match up nicely with Stephen Porges in this way, or is it sort of particular additions or things that are different that should be mentioned there?
They definitely match up. I mean, when Peter always says that he's so grateful for Stephen Porges' work because it explains things in a way that makes sense to people. Mm-hmm. I think Peter has had this knowledge anyway, but Stephen says it in a way that encapsulates the theory in a really sensible way.
Yeah, it seems like Porges is sort of scientifically orientated, where Levine will talk about like swirls of energy and things like this that might put off people who are less, you know, who orientate more towards the scientific neurological side of things.
Right. And Porges also really has a long evolutionary piece that goes with it, which makes perfect sense in the nervous system, you know, because our nervous system, it's developed over, you know, millions of years, and the certain functions stay on, you know, and and how do they serve us now, and that's really valuable information. It's been around a long time, you know, but somebody's actually naming it.
Yeah. And it's a sort of more sophisticated version of like a triune brain theory of, like, you know, we have a kind of lizard brain that's fight or flight, and then we have this mammalian connection system, and then this human neocortex, which tends to sort of get turned off if the other two aren't getting their needs met.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. He Paul MacLean did a nice job with that one. I still use that triune brain.
I like it as an explanatory model, though. I've been told sort of neuroscientists and things would say it was terribly outdated, and you know, would be a bit careful that there isn't someone in the room who's a neuroscientist that says this is complete nonsense.
Right. I've heard the same thing, but I find it quite helpful. One of the exercises that I do with my performers is that so we talk about there's thinking, feeling, and sensing from the three different brains, is to sing a song and just think about what you're singing, and then sing the same song and just feel the emotion, you know, what you feel. And then the third way is to sing the song and just sense. And then ask the audience, you know, the group of people who are there, which one did you like better? You know, what moved you more? And it's a very interesting exercise. So I do still use that.
Right. Yeah. As I say, it's as a sort of simple explanatory model, it can really help. Even I sort of usually just preface it these days by saying, well, you know, this isn't entirely neuroscientifically true, and it's a bit more complex than this, but this is a sort of a basic way of thinking about things. Yeah.
And I think, you know, for a lot of people, basic, easy, simple explanations are going to make it accessible, you know, and inviting.
Yeah, I've also heard a sort of trend in the kind of trauma world at the moment of using lots and lots of scientific kind of jargon. You know, this sort of neuroscientific, neuro-bunk, neuroscientific jargon, and it can sound very impressive, but I think it's just sort of trying to claim some kind of authority, and it doesn't necessarily help you work better with people.
I agree. And I think also at this point that, you know, it's kind of catchy now. Oh, well, neuroscience says this and that, you know, neuroscience says that. And it's become a little like, okay, neuroscience is not God, you know?
Right. It's not the Bible, is it? There's like the Bible says it has that quality to it, doesn't it, when people say it? Yeah.
Yeah. This, like, it's almost like I think, well, this too shall pass, you know?
Right.
Because there's practical observations that make sense also, you know? So, not that I'm, you know, obviously not against it at all, but I think it's tending a little overboard in some circles these days, and it just doesn't prove everything. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and it can be after the fact explanatory rather than actually opening up something new. And you know, also knowing about something. I'm very interested at the moment in different ways of knowing, and knowing about something is not the same as knowing something.
Yeah. But again, I think that brings up the distinction we were talking about before, is knowing it sort of, you know, the expression in my bones or in my, you know, in my gut, you know, that those ideas of my body, or the resonance, the somatic resonance, knowing it inside.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a experiential knowing personally, and then there's that community knowing of being embedded in the community thereof, you know?
Yes.
And procedural knowing of actually having a skill rather than cognitive knowing. We've got a guy called John Vervaeke coming on the podcast soon. He's a philosopher who's sort of big on this. So I'm looking forward to opening these up. And I think it'll be very interesting as a teacher of embodiment, because we're essentially teaching being, skills, communally, interpersonally. We're teaching, and as you sort of talked about somatic resonance, we're teaching in a way which is far beyond this, the mainstream way of knowing about things as the privileged kind of knowing. So this is something that is worth digging into a little bit as someone in this field.
I think it's great. Mark, I just think it's so wonderful that you're just gathering all of this information and putting it out to people and offering people just a different perspective on life than the modern society has given. And I just think it's wonderful, these different angles that you're bringing to public awareness. It's really a service. I thank you.
I appreciate that. And this is kind of one of the things I want to get across with the Embodiment Conference, the podcast, and all the trainings I'm involved in is, hey, this isn't just a set of skills to do yoga better or whatever.
Right.
It's actually a different perspective on life and society and everything, right?
Agreed. Yeah. And it's an aspect that's kind of been left out for a long time. And yet on another level, it's not left out at all. It rules us,
Right. It's in charge whether we know it or not.
Yeah, exactly. With the whole understanding of the vagus nerve, and 80% of its fibers, go from the body to the brain, which means that your body is telling us how we feel, not my brain. And so it's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Maybe I should start to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's how my life could change. So many people are looking for a change in life, that their life is just not in line with who they are or what they think they are, or what they dream or imagine. And one way in is to get to know from inside, not from just, deciding in your brain or your mind what you want or you think should be, or what other people tell you should be. Yes.
And I feel like, how about an example? Like, can you give me an example of one or two sort of case studies of people you work with? I'm also keen to tie the Alexander technique into this a little bit as well.
Yeah. Let me think. I mean, the Alexander technique, I'll go that way. His principles are well thought out and quite brilliant, in the sense that the system has, especially we'll take one with the musculoskeletal system, has a very specific design. And if we use ourselves or follow that design, movement can be quite easy and flowing. And when we have that kind of movement, we feel easy and flowing. You know what I mean? And so accessing that aspect of the musculoskeletal system can be really helpful. And it can, I think this is why the Alexander technique has survived for, over 100 years, is that for some people, their sort of offness, should we say, is really caused not by some major psychological issue where their mother didn't pay attention to them or something like that.
Yeah.
Just kind of ignorance or uneducated is a better word. It's like, oh, I didn't know that I could walk like this or bend like this or move like this, or that my shoulder moves this way. And once you teach them that, it's like the back pain or whatever is gone. The Alexander technique has a really good track record for eliminating pain, even though they don't like to be known for that.
Yeah.
Because it's not the only thing that happens. One of the major aspects of the technique is the aspect of what Alexander called inhibition. And it's different from Freud's inhibition in that it's recognizing a pattern and then saying, no, I'm not going to do that. Or using too much effort and recognizing, oh, I just picked up a pencil with 10 times more effort than is needed. then I wonder why I'm tired, why I'm burnt out, why I'm feeling over something. And I realize I could pick up that pen with much less effort.
Yes.
And on a simple level, it's like, oh, I can make that choice and I can do that and I feel different. And like I said, there's no psychological major issues need to be dealt with.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't have to always be about someone's deep-seated issues with their mother. And
exactly.
It can just be the use kind of thing, functionality.
Exactly.
And then, as you said, sometimes, however, though, with the trauma stuff gets in the way, right? So maybe you could give an example of that. Like if you're trying to work and just on functional Alexander technique kind of level, and you realize like, hey, there's a trauma pattern in here.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I was working with a singer actually, and every time she would sing a certain phrase, she kept tightening her right hand, and I pointed it out, and again, oh, did anything ever happen? No, nothing ever happened. And as we continued to work, over time, she remembered that when she was younger, she had surgery on her right side, and there was this sort of aversion of wanting to push away that person, the surgeon, even though, of course, medical trauma is an interesting one because it's often necessary, and yet that doesn't it doesn't prevent the system from recognizing that it's being cut into, which is being attacked.
Yeah, you can't rationalize with that part of the brain. And it's an interesting one, isn't it? That not all trauma comes from abuse. Sometimes it's necessary dental or medical procedures, or
exactly
a parent said in the heat of the moment, or it could even be, a parent screaming at a child to stop them getting hit by a car.
Exactly. Yeah. So with this young woman, when she realized that, she had this surgery, and then she just was so petrified as a young person and wanting to push away whatever was going on over there, working through that defensive pattern just changed everything in her singing and in her life. And she was like shocked that was what was going on.
This is interesting as well, isn't it? When you do this kind of work with people, that it's not just helping their posture be a bit better, or their singing voice, or them. It's something else that happens, right?
Oh, exactly. As a matter of fact, the posture is the least of it in a way, because it's you can't paste good posture on, you know what I mean? It's who I am. And when I'm fully in myself, and like we mentioned before, in a welcoming, socially engaged way, then I'm upright, open, and my body is that way, welcoming with so-called good posture. But it's not something that you can paste on.
Okay.
That's the way I talk about it.
Tell us about the latest book, because it's got a pretty, I've only just heard the name today, and it's a pretty interesting name. So
yes.
About that?
Yeah, the title is Humanual, and it's a manual for being human. And, when I wrote The Actor's Secret, I was working with, and was working with a lot of performers, and I love that work. But I also have a long history of meditation practice and spiritual practice, and I just don't usually use that in my public persona.
Mm-hmm.
And part of me is now like, well, it's important to me and it's important to my work. I want to put that out there also. So Humanual it's kind of The Actor's Secret expanded. It includes a lot more of the evolutionary history, and it includes more. So it starts with, how we're formed and how we develop, both emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, and it just grows all these pieces. And the point of the book basically is the unity of the being, and how all of these, like how you, like we were just talking about posture before, how that is not separate from your spiritual, from your emotional, from your psychological, that you can go, like I was saying before, you can go in many different ways, but it's one self, it's one being on some level, and it's connected. And this is, again, an important part of my work. I would say there's three sort of pillars of my work, and that is the idea of support, how we're supported and how we have support in our lives, and suspension, or how we're able to expand and suspend and open and flow, and how that leads to breath, and how the in and the out and the interaction with the earth and the sky, the universal. We don't live in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And that's really important. And so those three pillars are what I tend to, and the way I see the trauma work is how the trauma work has affected these three aspects of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. We've had different people come on the podcast, and a number of them have had, several of them have actually used the term pillars. I also used to use that term. Or they'll say there's the four things, or the three things, the five things. And it's kind of nice as an embodiment teacher to come back to some of these kind of key reference points. Breath, movement, posture, whatever it is.
Yes. Yeah. I because they're so foundational. Because if I don't have a kind of support, I'm just knocked over all the time.
Yeah. And for me, it's funny. I've learned all these sophisticated techniques, and some days, like I'm going for a bit of a rough patch at the moment, to be honest, Betsy. And sometimes it's like little simple things, like putting my feet on the ground, or
exactly
aligning my structure in a way that is
exactly.
Okay, simple, easy. I love that about the thing you did at the Embodiment conference. Is just how simple. You taught about 4 or 5 tools in about half an hour, and each one of them was a little gem.
Yeah. And that's what Humanual is more about, is that those simple kind of for everybody. And yet at some places in the book, there's deep explanations for people who are very skilled in lots of ways, but it's kind of wants to be for everybody. Like you said, to just put your feet on the ground. I'm having a hard patch. I'm just feeling like I got, I didn't get what I wanted. I'm not, something's out of line. Okay, where are my feet? Oh, they're touching the ground. Okay, I got it. Okay, and it's just like there's the ground, and the ground always provides a kind of support. Whether we know about it or care about it, whatever is under us is supporting us, and that's so simple, so huge in terms of our taking a breath and going on to the next step. Yeah.
Okay. Well, before we move towards wrap up, can you offer a practical one out to people? I mean, if there's something people could do listening to this.
Well, I think the support I just talked about, to me, would be that. Mm-hmm. I could sort of do it a little more in detail. So if you bring is that okay?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. So bring your attention to your feet. And then more specifically, the bottoms of your feet. And the bottoms of your feet, and how and where they meet the ground. And you'll notice that certain parts of your foot are happy to be on the ground, and others are just kind of pulling up away from the ground. That sort of fear pattern. And just notice. And then recognize that it's kind of obvious that the ground is under you, but it might not be so obvious that the ground is under you in a supportive way. And what would happen if you had the thought, allow the ground to support me? And just notice with that thought what happens throughout your system. And then to be more specific, notice your ankles and allow the ground to support through your ankles. Any change that happens with that. And that moves up to your knees, the support. And then your hip joints. So we have the major joints in your legs supported by the ground. And back to your feet and the ground. And receiving the support, allowing the support to come up through you. And then your lower torso into your spine, from the ground, up through your spine and your torso, and your shoulders, elbows, wrists, and hands from the ground. Your hands are supported from the ground, not holding up, and into your neck and head. And then looking around, as I said before, you're never without an environment. You're always responding. But what if you looked around this familiar space that you're in, that you're listening from, but you looked around recognizing that you're supported from the ground, so that you look around with that support and just noticing that small or not so small, filled in kind of difference, or your breath, or some kind of expansion or connection. Yeah.
Betsy, lovely. Thank you. It's nice to offer a practical thing out. You know, I was talking about embodiment's a weird thing, and it's nice to offer that out to listeners. So, yeah. Okay. So in terms of finding out more about you, they can, of course, come to training in Brighton, though by the time this comes out, it's going to be pretty soon. So that is the 14th and 15th of May in Brighton. And people will find all the details online if they just put in Betsy Polatin, Polatin, Brighton. No doubt that will come up. In terms of websites and things, what would you point people to?
My main website now that has most of the classes that I'm teaching is theactorssecretbook.com.
Okay.
And it's two S's, one for actors and one for secret.
But there's some other websites online as well, isn't there? You've got a few websites.
I do have a few websites, but that's the most up-to-date one. And even I'm a little lax sometime on that. But for the most part, that has where I'll be when. Okay,
great. There it is, the Actor's Secret. So final message about the body, Betsy, today.
Just honor it. Really, it's not separate. It's not even the body. It's not a separate thing. We are one entity that includes the physicality. Betsy. And can't leave it out.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mark. Again, I really appreciate you and all the work that you're doing.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodifacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If you're, most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodifacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodifacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.